All right, guys. So let me get this started up. Today we are gonna start wrapping up our study on the Roman Empire. If you remember, we left off kind of at the end of the Republic when Julius Caesar was murdered on the Senate floor on the Ides of March by some of his friends because he had named himself dictator for life, and they did not like it. And so what we're left with is a bit of chaos and a bit of civil war going on. But we have one guy who kind of emerges out of this as the leader, and his name is Octavian. And Julius Caesar had actually taken it upon himself to name Octavian his heir. Now, there's some debate about who exactly Octavian was to Julius Caesar, but most consensus say it was like his nephew or stepson or stepnephew, like somehow related to Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar named him to be his heir, and meaning for him to take over as dictator of the empire. Now, this had not happened before because if you remember, we had a republic where leaders were elected, not named as heirs. So there was a lot of civil war that followed. And part of that was caused by Octavian, who decided he was going to take it upon himself to avenge Caesar's death. And so he managed to track down and take care of and defeat all of the members of Senate who had betrayed Caesar and murdered him. That was part of it. And one of his biggest rivals was this guy named Mark Antony. And if you look into it, it's really quite sordid detail, or quite convoluted and complicated history of how Mark Antony comes to become his biggest rival. But he does, and so Octavian has to fight Mark Antony, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail coming up here. But Octavian's rule did lead to something called the Pax Romana, and this is known as the Roman peace. Again, we'll talk about that when we get to the end. So let's talk about this Mark Antony character for a little bit. We have, in Egypt, there's a series of civil wars that happen. People are taking sides, it gets kind of ugly, and all of that is over who's going to take over the Egyptian throne when the king dies. And so eventually, after these civil wars, Cleopatra claims the throne of Egypt, and Mark Antony marries Queen Cleopatra. Cleopatra is a direct descendant of Ptolemy. Now, if you remember, if you think back to Alexander the Great, when he died, his generals divided his empire into 3 different chunks, and one of those was Egypt, and we called it Ptolemaic Egypt, and it was the one that lasted the longest. Cleopatra was a direct descendant of that general Ptolemy, and was the last link in this line of Ptolemaic Egypt and the Hellenistic era that was going on there, left over from Alexander the Great many, many years before. And things start to get even messier when Antony and Cleopatra decide that they want to put their foothold in Rome. If you remember from some of the videos we've watched and things we've read, the Roman Empire has grown to be huge, and it has taken over much of the Mediterranean. And they control a lot of the trade, and they're very wealthy. And so Mark Antony and Cleopatra want a piece of that. So they start trying to find a way to take over Rome. And eventually, Mark Antony and Cleopatra come face to face with Octavian, who has been named the ruler of Rome. And Octavian starts trying to chase them back to Egypt and get them out of Rome. And we all kind of comes to a head at this thing called the Battle of Actium. This happens in 31 BCE. It is a naval battle, so it happens at sea, near Actium, Greece. Both of their fleets have about 200 ships that are going to fight each other. And when Antony and Cleopatra realize that they're outmatched by Octavian and his navy, they start to retreat to Egypt. And once they return to Egypt, Antony and Cleopatra realize they're going to be defeated, and they commit suicide at putting an end to that whole piece of the civil war, giving Octavian the sole rulership of the Roman Empire. So nobody's challenging him anymore, or at least there's no big threat to him anymore, and Octavian is the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. And this is a really big deal, because this kind of is what people see as the marked end of the Republic, and the beginning of the Empire. So Octavian, as is tradition, with a lot of rulers, decides to take on a new name when he becomes the sole ruler of Rome. And so he takes the title Caesar Augustus, which means greatly honored one. And yes, Augustus is where we get the name for the month of August. Julius Caesar, we get the name July for that, and then Augustus is for August. And Octavian, him being the sole leader of Rome, actually doesn't turn out to be such a bad thing in some people's eyes, because after many, many years of civil war and people losing families and losing farms and losing money, Octavian's able to bring peace to the Roman world. He keeps the Senate around, which kind of appeases those wealthier families, but they don't have the same role and power they used to. They're now kind of more advisors to Octavian, and they don't have the power to make laws and things like that, but they do play a pretty big role in his government, which makes them happy. Overall, he starts to push the borders of the Roman Empire and grow the empire a little bit, which ultimately helps to improve the economy, bringing in more money and more wealth to the empire. He fights corruption, which is what a lot of the old Senate had that caused a lot of the civil wars and the problems to begin with, and so he makes it one of his goals to fight that corruption and keep the government from being corrupt again. And then after his death, they decide to deify him. What it means to deify someone, it means that they are officially declared to be a god. And so he's worshipped as a god. And many other emperors after him follow this, and some of them even deify themselves in life. And so people are worshiping them as they rule Rome. And what I talked about earlier, Octavian's rule marks the beginning of what is called the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana is Latin, because that's what they spoke in the Roman Empire. And it's Latin for Roman peace, and it lasted from about 30 BCE all the way to 180 CE. So it's like 200 years with no major threats to the empire. It just kind of exists in this era of peace, and it's really great for everybody. And this is a picture from one of our textbooks that shows kind of the growth of the empire. I wanted to show you this for a second. The yellow on this map shows the Roman territory by 44 BC. This is when Julius Caesar is in charge. He has helped to gain this area over here in Gaul. This is modern France. So if you notice, all the yellow area, so Gaul, Spain, this northern part of Africa, this is what they gained during the Punic Wars. Okay, remember they also took Greece and Macedonia, which is up here, and pieces over here in the Asia Minor. And so they own all this land when Julius Caesar is killed and Octavian takes over. Octavian then takes this and he pushes them and uses these natural boundaries to help rule the empire. So if you look, he kind of pushes it up here to the Atlantic Ocean. He pushes the empire up over these mountains to the Danube River to use that as a natural barrier, a natural boundary, all the way to the Black Sea. And they also, this is when they take over Egypt after he defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He gets Egypt for the Roman Empire, and so he gets this area and pushes the boundary all the way out here to the Red Sea. So it's pretty big. Then after Octavian, the other emperors start to gain momentum, and they gain a few more pieces of land. And by 118 AD, that's when the Roman Empire has reached its largest point. Okay, and so all the purple area has added, and they own all this land up here in Great Britain. They own all of northern Africa. They own the Sinai Peninsula in Jerusalem, and what's now Syria. They have Asia Minor. They have all of this land, which brings in a lot of wealth and a lot of territory and people, and makes things pretty great for the Roman Empire for a while. Okay, after Augustus dies peacefully, his stepson Tiberius becomes emperor. And it's become very clear that Rome is now a monarchy. There's no more republic. But this also causes some problems because they have no real line of succession, which means that they don't really have a way to know who's going to be the emperor after one dies. And that can cause some problems because people start to fight over who's going to take over the power. And so while the Roman Empire is mostly at peace, there's every time a new emperor needs to be chosen, a little bit of there becomes a little bit of a problem. But here are some of the emperors that made a big impact. This is not all the emperors that ruled, but they've had a pretty big impact on things. We had a guy named Trajan who comes in and conquers a bunch of new territory for Rome. Hadrian is one who traveled to many Roman provinces, meaning he traveled all over the Roman Empire. He even built a wall we know as Hadrian's Wall. You can see pieces of it. He built that to separate Rome from the non-Roman provinces, to keep people out of the Roman Empire who they didn't want in, who they viewed as more savage and uncivilized. And then we had this guy named Marcus Aurelius, who wrote a famous book on philosophy. He was also a pretty strong emperor. There were many others that had a pretty big role in the growth of the Roman Empire that you can look up at another time, but these are kind of some of the bigger major players. But what some of the other ones did, and what Rome is really known for, is they built roads. Okay, and these weren't just like dirt roads like leading down a backwards path. They were planned out, they were paved, they were very well maintained, and they built them all over. So if you look here at this map, you can see all the lines that show all these Roman roads that were built to travel all over the empire, and that really helped a whole lot with spreading trade and spreading ideas and things like that. So it was a pretty big deal. So now you might be wondering, isn't this around the time when Jesus came around? And the answer would be yes. So let's talk about what Roman rule looked like around the time when Jesus started to come on the scene. So the Jews and the Jewish community was around this whole time, hanging out kind of in the Sinai Peninsula over in Jerusalem and Judea. Eventually, as you saw on the map earlier, Romans took control of Judea, which was the Jewish kingdom. And many Jews opposed Roman rule, and there were a couple of reasons for that, but the main one was this. Generally, Romans allowed the people in their empire to keep their religion and worship their own gods if they also committed to worshiping the Roman gods and emperors as well. And this to the Romans was a sign of loyalty if you adapted their religion. As you can imagine, the Jews, who only had one god and were told not to worship multiple gods, took a little bit of issue with this, and they refused, in fact, to worship the Roman gods, which caused a lot of conflict. Okay, so let's talk about Jesus' life for a second. So this is the Mediterranean Sea right here. Okay, we're looking at the far eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. If you remember, we've got the Sea of Galilee. There's also the Jordan River that you can't see on this map, but that runs down here to the Dead Sea. So Jesus' life. Okay, he's born in Bethlehem, as we well know. He's from Nazareth, but is born in Bethlehem. Raised up here in Nazareth, over by the Sea of Galilee. Okay, he's baptized in the Jordan River, which is running through here. Okay, he's crucified in Jerusalem, all the way down here. And he preached how to live as God intended and so much more. And he did it all in this general area here. But eventually, that all starts to grow and spread across the Roman Empire. And there's some reasons for that. Okay, and if you look at Roman history and what was done during how the Romans were treating and living their lives, it really contributed to the spread of Christianity. And here's why. The first reason was roads. As we just looked at, there were a ton of roads all the way through the Roman Empire, which allowed people to travel very safely. It was much safer than sea travel. Sea travel caused a lot of issues because you could come across storms, you could come across pirates, it just took longer. Whereas roads allowed you to travel from town to town relatively quickly and easily, at least for the time. Okay, and we see that a lot with Paul. When you look at in your maps, in your Bibles and things like that, if you look at a map of Paul's travels, he travels all over the Roman Empire. And he's able to do that because of the safety of the roads. Another reason it was able to spread, a lot of the earliest scriptures are written in Greek. Now, if you think back to the area of the world that was able to speak Greek, the Romans adapted a lot of Greek. They were able to speak Greek. Many people, majority of people were able to speak Greek, not Latin. And so because the earliest scriptures were written in Greek, that meant that a lot of people could read it. And so the message that was written down in those Gospels and in the earlier scriptures could be spread very easily because everybody could read it. The other thing was the message that was being sent out. Now, the Roman Empire, despite being a pretty wealthy empire, had a lot of wealth. There's a pretty big gap in the wealth, right? So there's a lot of people who aren't super rich, who aren't very wealthy, who don't have a lot of power, and God's message really spoke to them because it spoke to this message of truth that we are all loved and we are all treasured by God, and they really liked that, and people took to it. Now, the Romans really liked order and they liked things to go their way. And so the Romans actually feared the Christians, which led to a lot of persecution. They feared that worshiping God, like their one God, was a sign of disloyalty to the Roman Empire. As we mentioned, they didn't mind if people worshipped other gods as long as they worshipped the Roman gods too. But the Jews and Christians refused to do that. And they feared that they would anger the Roman gods because, remember, this is their religion. That's what they believed, and that's who they believed controlled everything. And so it was a pretty big deal if people weren't going to worship them. So that was something they feared, and so that led to a lot of persecution. Okay, some Romans opposed Christians and sought ways to persecute them. We see this a lot in Acts when Saul is traveling around before he becomes Paul. He's actively persecuting and killing Christians on a regular basis, and that was not unusual. There were a lot of Romans who sought to do that. There's this crazy emperor named Nero, who, under his rule, he was an emperor of Rome. Under his rule, the city of Rome caught on fire and burned down, and he was looking for someone to blame, and so he blamed it on the Christians and turned everybody against them and said it was the Christians' fault that Rome burned to the ground. And so many Christians were persecuted and killed because of him. And it leads us to having. They were also killed in the Colosseum, in gladiator fights and fights with wild animals and things like that, purely for people's entertainment. And we call a lot of these people, we call them martyrs. And martyrs are people who die for their faith. And so a lot of Christians in the Roman Empire became martyrs. And this went on for hundreds of years until we come to this guy named Constantine. Constantine became emperor of Rome. He was a pretty open guy. He had a dream one night before an important battle he was going into that told him to fight under the sign of the cross, and so he did. And he won. And so in 313 CE, now I want you to think about that for a second. Okay? Christ was born around that turn between BC and AD, or BCE and CE. This is 300 years after that. Okay, so 300 years of persecution it took before Constantine won fighting under the sign of the cross, and so he ended and put a stop and said it is no longer allowed for you to persecute Christians. He becomes a Christian himself, and that gradually leads to some things that happened with the church and the growth of the church that we unfortunately just don't have time to get into this year. But I encourage you to go and look at that. So that's all I have for our Roman Empire. The Roman Empire does end up falling. It falls in two pieces, so we end up with an empire called Byzantium in the eastern part that lasts for quite a bit longer than the western half. But you'll learn about that in future classes and courses you take. So thanks for sticking with me. If you have questions, feel free to let me know.